Hey everybody, you should have now finished reading chapter 6. And what we're going to do now is expand on the topic covered there and discuss the social context of knowledge more generally. First, we're going to do some details of testimony, really bring out some of the stuff that was discussed in the chapter, but then we're going to expand beyond the scope of testimony and look at the social structures that are implicated when we generate systems of knowledge, the systems that we use to perpetuate testimonial structures, so things like education and schooling, that sort of thing, and what these structures mean for our epistemic project more generally. So first, let's just take a quick look at what we talked about in this chapter, testimony. Testimony is the dominant source of beliefs in the modern world. We read books, we read the newspaper, we listen to the radio, we tweet with our friends, we go on Facebook. All of this is testimony. Somebody said or wrote down or communicated to you some state of affairs, some supposed fact about the world. And that's where most of our beliefs come from. Think about all the countries you've never seen. Your belief in those countries relies upon testimony. Not just their existence, but every fact you know about it. Their history, their culture, their language. In fact, anything that you rely on having someone else having told you to believe, well, that's just testimony. Testimony is a little bit tricky, though. And at least partially, this trickiness comes from the fact that when we rely upon testimony, we're relying upon an agent with its own desires and beliefs. That is, another human being that may have goals that would marginalize their accuracy. We all know that people sometimes lie to get what they want. We all know that people twist or spin stories in their favor. We all know that people may just want to appear authoritative even when they have no justification for it. These are circumstances that would seem to marginalize the value of testimony. These sorts of concerns are part of what influences what we might call testimonial skepticism, the belief that the beliefs we generate from testimony are simply not knowledge. They might be very, very reliable beliefs, but they're not knowledge. The primary historical proponent in your text that discusses this is John Locke of this view. Right? Locke says that it does not matter how much you trust the person, it's still not knowledge because you don't have the proper kind of justification. That is, right, remember that knowledge requires justification, or typically is seen as such. In this case, you don't have the proper kind of justification because you're relying on the truth-tellingness and capability of another person. This view is dim, or pessimistic, one might say, because it means that most of our beliefs, even very probable ones, do not count as knowledge. How many of us have, for instance, independently verified the atomic weights of elements on the periodic table? How many of you have independently verified every experiment you've been taught about in science classes, right? How many doctors have gone through and tested every single procedure for efficacy with a large enough sample size to draw their proper procedures? How many of us really can verify that medicines, most of them, do what they actually say they're going to do? Right? We rely upon testimony a huge amount. If none of that counts as knowledge, then it seems that most of our getting around isn't knowledge. Now, this might not be terrible because we can still have room for justified beliefs. And that's really the more central concept to functioning, in a sense. This is something we talked about when we talked about the internalism-externalism debate in, I think, chapter 5. But it does lead questions things like, well, then what's the use of the concept of knowledge if knowledge is so incredibly limited? What value does it have, and is it of any epistemic worth if almost everything we believe we don't know? The next level of the next way we might treat testimony in general is what we call testimonial reductionism. Reductionism here just means it's the same as everything else. So testimony is a source of knowledge that is just the same as everything else. And this typically requires that we be able to justify our faith in a given testimony. There's two different ways we might do this. So there's global reductionism and local reductionism. Global reductionism says that really what we need to do is be justified in believing that, generally speaking, testimony is accurate. That is, you have been through your life, and most of what most people have told you has been true. Therefore, you are justified in trusting the next testimony that comes up. Well, one trick here is that we know that different people are differently trustworthy. And we don't just accept the word of someone who we've never met before and do not know the credentials of as a distributor of facts, right? If some stranger walked up to you on the street and told you that the medicine you were taking wasn't safe, I don't know I would believe them because I don't know if they had any legitimate epistemic claim here. A narrower version of reductionism, and the one that's promoted by this sort of concern I'm talking about now, is called local reductionism. And in this case, what you need to do is justify each independent case of testimony. That is, you need to be able to assess that the other person's being truthful. This is typically done through things like attending to nonverbal cues. You need to assess their credentials, etc. Now, the reductionist is going to say that testimony is the same kind of knowledge as anything. The exceptionalist, however, and that's our final view of how we might treat testimony, is going to say that testimony is in fact a distinct source of knowledge. The example given in the book is Lackley and the bucket brigade. So bucket brigades were these old ways of fighting fires where you just pass a bucket full of water and then toss it on the fire at the end. Well, the idea is you pass a bucket full of water down the line and everybody gets that bucket full of water. And so you can generate knowledge through testimony, right? You can transmit it directly. She interestingly goes further and denies the possibility that the person handing the bucket even really needs to know. Needs to be knowledgeable to be able to transmit knowledge. She gives the example of a teacher who doesn't believe, say, in, I think it's evolution, yet teaches their class about it anyway. And in that case, they may be communicating knowledge, though they themselves do not have it, because they don't believe, right? So these are three different ways we can look at testimony. Either it doesn't generate knowledge, it can generate knowledge, but in the typical way, and it needs to be tested for reliability, or there's something special about testimony that helps us generate knowledge. Right? Another example of this is some have suggested that testimonial accuracy is in fact the base case of knowledge. That is why we invented like knowledge talk, is to imbue certain people as being reliable informants. This is an interesting idea and has certain connections with the cynical theory of knowledge, right? That we imbue people with the term knowing as a way to give them a special or privileged social position. However, there are reasons to doubt that this would be the case. Regardless, these are the general questions of testimony, and this is the general context in which to think about the stuff that you've just read now. Since we've talked about testimony a bit, and you've read about it already, let's expand our view. Right? Testimony is one way through which social structures can give us knowledge. Right? The media gives us knowledge, like news, etc. Our friends and family give us knowledge. Our teachers and colleagues, right? Or they at least give us beliefs, right? They testify to us all the time. They tell us facts all the time. And this shows that testimony involves a larger social context. And the way that social context is structured is going to be important to epistemology. The study of the societal structures that influence our systems of knowledge and belief is called social epistemology. Typically. There's other names for it too, but that's the one we're going to be using. And social epistemology has some interesting hiccups to it that really make us question the reliability of this testimony stuff, which is, after all, the majority of our beliefs, right? This is where most of it comes from. Now, one thing we can do to ensure our accuracy of our testimony, and one thing we do is we use what's called triangulation. Triangulation is when you use multiple independent modes of verification to test a single claim. Now, this is, right, in some ways you might be like, well, I'm going to test if there's a bookshelf here by knocking on it. Okay, well, that's one way, and I don't know, smell it and look at it. All these things, that's a triangulation, right? That's a visual, auditory, sensory triangulation. Testimonial triangulation is going to be asking different people, right? This is why, for instance, in the sciences, we look for multiple different replications of a study. It's being triangulated. We have multiple independent modes of verification that tell us that a certain belief is reliable or true. Now, the thing that makes triangulation particularly important to understand in this social context is it is responsible for building what we might consider epistemic structures in the world. We have established systems of generating and testing beliefs, established structures that are designed specifically to give you this. The scientific community is one example of this. It's a social structure that is designed to communicate and triangulate different beliefs from across the world, right? They're coming at the same problem through different ways, through different experimental methodologies, and through replicating the same experiments in independent conditions. As a result, these very significant social structures begin to have developed, and they will influence what we take to be justified belief or knowledge. For instance, take the scientific community. This is one of the most prominent epistemic structures in the world right now. It is a valuable tool, absolutely, but it also has some potentially problematic biases. So one thing is it has been widely noted that science is weird. Weird here is an acronym meaning Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies dominate the scientific world. Now this is becoming less so in the modern world, as countries that don't quite fit this mold are becoming more scientifically active. However, the history of science is rooted in these weird countries, and the practice of science is largely rooted in these countries. Now, imagine that you take those values, right? Because you're going to have values based upon whatever culture you come from. You take your Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic values with you on your scientific discoveries. Now, on one hand, we might say, well, physics, probably not going to matter what you think about it. But what about psychology, sociology, and anthropology? All of the social sciences require significant assumptions about how human beings work. And if you take your own values in with you, and you pretty much have to because you have to have values, right? You're going to be a psychologically functioning human being, right? You're going to be a person, and people have biases. This can influence how you understand what's going on. These sort of criticisms have been replicated in numerous approaches. We've got feminist epistemology, we've got the field of science studies, etc. All of these views come together to point out the fact that our epistemic authority structures are really biased towards very narrow sorts of views. Right? Not only are the sciences weird, they're generally speaking predominantly male. And in fact, so is the university system. Again, these historical trends are decreasing. But for much of history, the university system was almost entirely white men, right? Totally governed by them. And if you're in a situation like that, it is possible that even without meaning to, their cultural values, in fact, it's almost inevitable that even without meaning to, their cultural values are going to influence what they take to be knowledge. Think about things like the literary canon, what books you're supposed to read in high school. What books are worth reading. That's a value judgment, and it's going to be influenced by our cultural perspective. Now, none of these people, not many of these critics, are going to suggest that all beliefs generated by these systems need to be thrown out just because there's some bias there. What they want, though, is bias correction, essentially. You need to acknowledge that all of your claims are coming from a certain sociological viewpoint, so that you can contextualize them more clearly. This is one of the reasons that there's been more of a push in recent years, and many of you might have been aware of this, to get women and various minorities involved in, for instance, the scientific process, right? Particularly called by STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, right? There's been a big push for that. Because these cultural biases that are being built in because of the demographic makeup of these fields might be destructive to their progress. So this is something to be aware of when we talk about testimony and social epistemology more generally, is that the values of the culture we're in and the systems of power that are at play there can significantly influence what we take to be knowledge, what beliefs are communicated, and the very structure of our system of thought. This has led some people to suggest that really what we need to be doing when we talk about epistemology is not talking about individual agents, single believers, but looking at larger social context. Because none of us have ever formed a belief in a total vacuum, right? We're always being influenced by cultural values. And that's just how it is. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a matter of fact. And if we want to understand how knowledge works, we need to be aware of and sensitive to that fact. So that's the general overview of some of the key issues in social epistemology that can accompany our discussions and thought about testimony. The key question for you to think about as you move forward is what does these questions about testimony and these questions about social epistemology, what do they tell us about knowledge? Right? Should we trust testimonial sources? Do we need to be critical of the social structures that give rise to our beliefs? And how do we go about improving our social epistemic structures in a way that makes them more reliable, right? A way that helps us know more clearly. So that's it for our lecture on social epistemology and testimony relating to KVSI Chapter 6. And I will see you again at our pre-lecture for Chapter 7.